Between January and May 1944, German Luftwaffe conducted over 300 reconnaissance flights over occupied Norway. These flights identified 47 Norwegian resistance positions, which were subsequently bombed. 183 resistance fighters died in those bombardments. But one unit survived using a weapon that cost nothing, required no ammunition, and fooled German pilots from 3,000 feet. Wooden artillery pieces carved from Norwegian pine that looked real enough to draw bombs, while the actual guns remained hidden and operational. The chisel blade bit into frozen pine. Gunnar worked the wood grain carefully, shaping the cylinder that would become a gun barrel. His hands moved fast despite the cold. The temperature sat at -18 degrees Celsius, and metal tools pulled heat from his fingers with every stroke. 4 hours remained before the next German reconnaissance flight would pass overhead. 4 hours to finish this wooden gun, position it in the clearing, and make it look real enough to fool a pilot photographing from 3,000 feet. The wood resisted. Pine froze hard at these temperatures, and each chisel strike required more force than it would in summer. Gunnar's breath clouded in front of his face. Around him, 3 other resistance members worked on separate components: carving wheels, shaping the gun shield, constructing the trail that would angle the barrel upward. They had no blueprints, just memory of what artillery looked like, and hope that memory would be accurate enough. Behind them, 600 meters deeper into the forest, sat the real artillery battery. 3 genuine 105mm howitzers positioned in reinforced dugouts, camouflaged under netting and branches. 47 men operated those guns. They had ammunition for maybe 2 weeks of sustained fire. They represented the strongest defensive position Norwegian resistance maintained in this sector of Troms County. If the Germans found them, the entire northern resistance network would collapse. The reconnaissance flights came like clockwork. Every 6 to 8 hours, a single German aircraft would cross this valley, flying north to south, photographing everything below. Sometimes a Focke-Wulf FW-189, sometimes a Messerschmitt Bf-110 fitted with cameras. The pilots followed the same route, maintaining the same altitude, taking overlapping photographs that German intelligence analysts would study for any sign of resistance activity. 3 weeks ago, that system had worked perfectly. A resistance group in the neighboring valley had built their positions too close to a logging road. The reconnaissance flights photographed them. Within 48 hours, Ju-88 bombers arrived and destroyed everything. Gunnar had watched the smoke rise over the mountains from 12 kilometers away, black columns that meant burning equipment and dead men. 23 resistance fighters died in that attack. The survivors scattered into the wilderness. Some made it out. Most didn't. That smoke still appeared in Gunnar's thoughts when he closed his eyes at night. The certainty that someone was watching from above, that your position was already known, that bombs were perhaps already loaded onto aircraft that would arrive tomorrow or the next day. The resistance operated under constant observation by an enemy that controlled the sky absolutely. Gunnar Sundsteby was 31 years old, a carpenter before the war, now a resistance fighter with Milorg, the Norwegian military underground organization. His brother Lars commanded one of the howitzer crews 600 meters behind him. Lars had written him a letter 2 weeks ago, delivered by courier. The letter described the ammunition situation, the condition of the guns, the morale of the crews. It ended with a question that wasn't really a question. Will the wooden guns work, or should we start planning evacuation routes? Gunnar had promised Lars 3 months ago that he would protect the battery. When the decision came down from Milorg Command to build decoy positions using wooden artillery, Gunnar had volunteered immediately. His carpentry skills made him the logical choice. But skills meant nothing if the deception failed. If German analysts recognized the wooden guns as decoys, they would intensify their search for the real battery. If the real battery was found, his brother would die along with 46 other men. The letter sat in Gunnar's jacket pocket now, folded tight, the paper soft from being read dozens of times. Lars had signed it simply, "Your brother." But Gunnar could read the fear behind the formality. Everyone in the battery knew that discovery meant death. There would be no warning, no time to evacuate. Just the sound of engines overhead, then explosions, then silence. The pressure of that promise weighed heavier than the cold. Gunnar shaped the wooden barrel with precision that came from understanding what failure would cost. This wasn't abstract resistance work. This was preventing his brother's death by making a piece of wood look like a cannon from 3,000 feet in the air. At Bardufoss Airfield, 70 kilometers south, Major Eric Hartmann prepared for his afternoon reconnaissance sortie. Hartmann was 43 years old, a Luftwaffe pilot with over 180 reconnaissance missions across Norway since 1942. He specialized in what German intelligence called Aufklärung, systematic observation and photography of enemy territory. Before the war, he had been a commercial photographer in Hamburg. The military had recognized his skill at reading landscapes, identifying subtle changes in terrain that indicated human activity. Hartmann approached reconnaissance with methodical precision. He flew the same routes repeatedly, memorizing every valley, every forest, every clearing. He knew which areas showed seasonal changes and which changes indicated resistance activity. He had identified 14 resistance positions in the past year through careful analysis of photographic sequences. 10 of those positions had been destroyed in subsequent bombing raids. His technique was simple. Photograph everything. Compare each flight's images to previous flights. Note any changes. New clearings, fresh tracks in snow, altered tree lines, smoke from fires. Norwegian resistance tried to hide, but hiding left traces that careful photography would reveal. Hartmann had learned to trust his camera more than his eyes. Human vision could be deceived by distance and altitude. Photographic film recorded everything with geometric honesty. He particularly focused on areas near known supply routes. Resistance groups needed ammunition, food, medical supplies. Those supplies had to move along routes that connected to something. Artillery batteries required the most supplies. They were the easiest targets to find because they needed the most support infrastructure. Hartmann had developed a system for identifying potential artillery positions by tracking supply movement patterns over weeks and months. His approach combined multiple intelligence disciplines. He correlated photographic reconnaissance with signals intelligence reports about radio transmissions from suspected areas. He studied weather patterns to understand when resistance groups would need to move supplies. He analyzed seasonal changes in forest cover that might reveal construction activity. Over 2 years of flying reconnaissance missions across Norway, he had developed an almost intuitive sense for which valleys contained military activity and which contained only wilderness. Hartmann kept detailed logs of every sortie. Each photograph was catalogued with precise coordinates, altitude, time, weather conditions, and his personal observations. When he returned from missions, he spent hours comparing new photographs to previous coverage of the same areas. Most changes were natural: snow accumulation, tree growth, seasonal variations. But occasionally he would spot changes that indicated human activity. New tracks, altered vegetation, structures that hadn't existed before. The German intelligence system depended on this meticulous documentation. Single photographs meant little, but sequences of photographs over weeks and months revealed patterns. A clearing that appeared in one photograph might be natural. The same clearing photographed 3 weeks later with signs of construction was probably military installation. Hartmann understood that resistance groups couldn't avoid leaving traces. His job was to identify which traces mattered and which were noise in the landscape. His reputation within Luftwaffe Reconnaissance Command was built on this systematic approach. He had fewer spectacular discoveries than some pilots who relied on visual observation during flights, but his photographic analysis identified more confirmed targets over time because he trusted documented evidence over intuition. Other pilots might spot something suspicious and photograph it once. Hartmann would photograph the same area repeatedly until he understood what he was seeing. This afternoon's sortie would cover the Molselv Valley region, where intelligence suspected increased resistance activity. Hartmann would fly at 3,000 meters, photographing a 30-kilometer corridor with overlapping images. The sortie would take 90 minutes. Weather was optimal. Clear sky, good visibility, minimal wind. Perfect conditions for detailed photography. He had photographed this same corridor 11 times in the past 6 months. Today's photographs would be compared against all previous coverage to identify any changes that might indicate resistance positions. Gunnar finished carving the barrel at noon. The wooden cylinder measured 2 meters in length, 30 centimeters in diameter, shaped to approximate a 105mm howitzer barrel. It looked crude up close, with chisel marks visible and proportions slightly wrong. But from 3,000 feet, through a camera lens, with shadows cast by low winter sun, it might look real enough. The other resistance members had finished the remaining components. They assembled the complete wooden gun in the forest, testing how it looked from different angles. The gun shield had the right general shape. The wheels were circular enough. The trail appeared sturdy, but it was still obviously wood to anyone who examined it closely. The deception depended entirely on altitude and speed. A pilot in a fast-moving aircraft wouldn't have time to study details. He would see gun-shaped object, photograph it, move on. They carried the wooden gun to the clearing they had prepared. The clearing sat on the valley's western slope, positioned where late afternoon sun would create shadows that defined the gun's shape in photographs. They had calculated the shadow angles carefully. Artillery casts distinctive shadows: the barrel's length, the wheel's circularity, the trail's angle. If the shadows looked wrong, the deception would fail immediately. Positioning took 30 minutes. They adjusted the gun's angle multiple times, checking how shadows fell as the sun moved. They scattered pine branches around the position to simulate recent construction activity. They deliberately left tracks in the snow leading to the clearing. Everything needed to suggest that resistance fighters had worked here recently, but tried to hide their work. The hardest part was making it look weathered. New construction looked obviously new in photographs. They kicked snow onto the wooden gun, let it freeze there, creating a texture that suggested the gun had been positioned for several days. They used axes to break branches near the clearing, making it look like the position had been occupied, used, maintained. Gunnar stood 200 meters downslope and studied the position through binoculars. The wooden gun looked plausible. Not perfect, but plausible. The barrel pointed roughly northeast. The shadows were strong. The surrounding disturbance suggested activity. If he were a German pilot photographing from a moving aircraft at 3,000 meters, he might believe this was a real artillery position that resistance fighters had tried to camouflage poorly. But he had no way to know if his judgment was correct. He was a carpenter, not a pilot, not a photographer, not an intelligence analyst. He was guessing what would fool someone whose expertise was specifically designed to avoid being fooled. The margin between success and catastrophic failure was knowledge he didn't possess. The choice that had led to this moment had been impossible. 2 weeks ago, Milorg Command presented the options: use the remaining pine lumber to build reinforced dugouts for the real artillery battery, making it harder to destroy if discovered, or use that lumber to build decoy positions elsewhere, hoping to divert German attention. Building reinforced positions meant accepting that discovery was inevitable and preparing to survive bombardment. Building decoys meant gambling that German reconnaissance could be deceived, buying time before discovery. Gunnar had voted for decoys. So had Lars. They understood the mathematics. If the real battery was discovered, reinforced positions might save some men, but not all. Bombs designed to destroy concrete bunkers would eventually destroy wooden dugouts. But if the Germans could be fooled into bombing decoy positions, the real battery could continue operating indefinitely. The gamble offered better odds than resignation to inevitable discovery. But the gamble meant committing resources to a strategy that might fail completely. If the wooden guns were recognized as decoys, German intelligence would intensify their search, knowing real positions existed nearby. The lumber used for decoys could have been used for winter shelters, storage facilities, defensive structures. Choosing deception meant accepting that failure would be worse than never having tried. 47 men depended on this deception working. 47 lives balanced on whether a carpenter could make wood look like steel from 3,000 feet in the air. The responsibility felt paralyzing. Gunnar had built houses, furniture, boats. He had never built something where failure meant his brother's death. The reconnaissance aircraft appeared at 14:30 hours. Gunnar heard it first, the distinctive engine sound of a Focke-Wulf FW-189, the twin-boom reconnaissance aircraft the Germans used extensively over Norway. He watched it approach from the south, flying steady at what looked like 3,000 meters, exactly as predicted. The aircraft followed the valley's center line, maintaining perfect altitude and heading. Gunnar stayed hidden in the tree line 500 meters from the wooden gun. 3 other resistance members crouched nearby, also watching. None of them moved. Movement attracted attention. Stationary objects in winter forests blended into the landscape. Moving objects stood out clearly. The FW-189 passed directly over the clearing where the wooden gun sat positioned. Gunnar watched through binoculars as the aircraft continued north without deviation, without circling back, without any indication the pilot had noticed anything unusual. The reconnaissance flight was routine. Photograph everything along the route, note positions for later analysis, continue to next sector. The critical moment was not the flight itself, but what would happen afterward. German intelligence analysts would develop the photographs, compare them to previous images of this valley, note the change, new clearing, new gun-shaped object, signs of recent activity. Then they would make a decision. Is this real artillery or elaborate decoy? Does it warrant bombing or continued observation? That decision would take days or weeks. Gunnar and the resistance unit would have no way of knowing when it happened or what conclusion the analysts reached. They would simply wait and watch the sky, knowing that if the analysts believed the deception, German bombers would eventually come to destroy a wooden gun. If the analysts saw through the deception, bombers would come searching for something else. Over the next 2 weeks, Milorg resistance units built 7 additional wooden artillery positions across northern Norway. Each position followed the same design principles Gunnar had developed: approximate proportions, careful shadow calculation, deliberate signs of poor camouflage. The strategy was systematic. Create enough plausible targets that German intelligence would have difficulty distinguishing real from fake, forcing them to divide bombing resources across multiple locations. Major Hartmann reviewed the reconnaissance photographs from the Målselv Valley on February 3, 1944. The new artillery position appeared clearly in overlapping images taken from his afternoon sortie. The position showed characteristic features: gun-shaped object with appropriate barrel length, wheel configuration matching known Norwegian artillery pieces, disturbed snow pattern suggesting recent construction, incomplete camouflage attempt. But something bothered Hartmann about the photographs. The position appeared too visible. Experienced resistance fighters understood aerial reconnaissance. They knew German flights photographed everything. Yet this position sat in a clearing with minimal overhead tree cover, easily visible from above. The camouflage attempt looked amateurish, almost deliberately poor. Hartmann had seen resistance groups make mistakes before. Desperation sometimes led to careless positioning. But this felt different. The position showed signs of careful construction. The gun was properly oriented. The surrounding area showed organized activity. The placement suggested tactical thinking. Why would fighters sophisticated enough to position a gun correctly be careless enough to leave it exposed? He marked the position as probable artillery emplacement, requiring additional reconnaissance before bombing authorization. German intelligence doctrine called for confirmation of target validity before committing bombing resources. A single reconnaissance photograph could be misleading. Multiple photographs from different angles and altitudes provided better confirmation. Hartmann planned his next sortie to include lower altitude photography of the suspected position. If the artillery was real, lower altitude would reveal additional details: ammunition storage, crew positions, support infrastructure. If the artillery was decoy, lower altitude might reveal construction inconsistencies invisible from 3,000 meters. The adaptation changed the game. Gunnar heard about it through Milorg intelligence networks. German reconnaissance flights were beginning to photograph suspected positions from multiple altitudes instead of standard 3,000-meter passes. The strategy indicated that German analysts suspected deception and were implementing countermeasures. Lower altitude photography would reveal details the wooden guns couldn't replicate: paint texture, construction materials, the absence of supporting equipment. Close examination would expose the deception immediately. The wooden guns only worked if German pilots photographed them quickly from high altitude and moved on. Extended scrutiny would reveal everything. Milorg Command made a decision. They would build additional decoys with more elaborate construction: fake ammunition crates, wooden crew positions, simulated tracks leading to false supply areas. They would make the deceptions deeper, betting that German analysts couldn't investigate every suspected position closely. Some decoys would be revealed as fakes, but some would continue drawing attention away from real positions. The strategy became a game of resource allocation. Germans had limited bombing capacity. Every bomb dropped on a wooden gun was a bomb not dropped on a real gun. Every reconnaissance flight photographing a decoy was a flight not searching elsewhere. As long as the deceptions consumed more German resources than they cost to build, the strategy succeeded. On February 17, 1944, German Ju-88 bombers struck 3 positions in northern Norway identified as artillery emplacements through aerial reconnaissance. 2 positions were wooden decoys. 1 was a real battery. The real battery was not Lars's unit, but a different position 30 kilometers west. The attack destroyed 2 of the real battery's 3 guns and killed 11 resistance fighters. Gunnar received the news through Milorg communication channels. The mixed results demonstrated both success and failure of the wooden artillery strategy. The Germans had been fooled enough to waste bombs on wooden guns. But they had also found and destroyed a real position, proving their reconnaissance and intelligence analysis remained effective despite the deceptions. The question became whether the strategy bought enough time to justify its risks. Every week, the wooden guns survived reconnaissance, added another week of operational security for the real positions. But every week also increased the probability that improved German reconnaissance techniques would identify and destroy those real positions. The mathematics of survival favored those who could maintain deception longest. Lars's battery remained undiscovered through winter and spring 1944. The wooden gun in the clearing 600 meters forward continued to sit there. photographed repeatedly by German reconnaissance flights, never bombed, never investigated closely. German intelligence had apparently classified it as low-priority target or possible decoy, not worth bombing resources. Either way, it served its purpose, drawing attention and photographic documentation while the real guns remained hidden and operational. In late April 1944, Allied intelligence provided Norwegian resistance with information about German reconnaissance patterns that had been decoded through signals intelligence. The information revealed that German analysts had identified approximately 40% of Norwegian decoy positions as probable fakes, but continued monitoring them because distinguishing certain fakes from real positions remained difficult without ground investigation. The Germans were aware of the deception strategy, but unable to counter it effectively without committing ground forces to physical verification of every suspected position. This created a strategic stalemate. Norwegian resistance couldn't hide their artillery completely. German reconnaissance could photograph everything from above. But photography alone couldn't distinguish wood from steel with certainty. Both sides understood the game they were playing, but neither could change the fundamental equation. Deception worked when verification was expensive. Major Hartmann flew his final reconnaissance sortie over northern Norway on May 15, 1944. By that point, he had photographed over 60 suspected artillery positions across the region, many of which he personally suspected were decoys, but couldn't confirm without ground verification. His reports to Intelligence Command noted the proliferation of suspected fake positions and recommended ground reconnaissance to confirm actual threats. The recommendation was denied due to resource limitations. German forces in Norway were stretched thin, focused on defending against potential Allied invasion along the coast. Hartmann understood the strategic implications. Norwegian resistance had found a vulnerability in German aerial reconnaissance doctrine. By forcing analysts to verify every suspected position, resistance had effectively paralyzed German bombing response. Intelligence couldn't authorize strikes against probable decoys, but couldn't ignore them either. The solution required ground forces to physically inspect suspected positions, but those forces were needed elsewhere. The wooden guns had achieved their purpose not by perfect deception, but by creating uncertainty that German forces couldn't resolve efficiently. The war ended in Norway on May 8, 1945, with German surrender. Lars's artillery battery had never been discovered or attacked. The wooden gun in the clearing remained there through spring 1945, weathered by rain and snow, still photographed occasionally by German reconnaissance flights up until the final weeks of occupation. Post-war analysis of German intelligence records revealed that the position had been classified as probable decoy in March 1944, but retained in target database because certainty couldn't be achieved without ground verification. Gunnar survived the war and returned to carpentry in peacetime. He built houses in Tromsø for 20 years, retiring in 1965. He rarely spoke about his resistance work, considering it simply what needed to be done during occupation. When historians interviewed him in the 1970s about the wooden artillery project, he downplayed his contribution. The idea had come from Milorg Command, he said. Many people had built wooden guns. His brother's survival was luck, not skill. The Germans could have found them at any time. But that assessment underestimated what the wooden artillery strategy accomplished. Post-war analysis of German reconnaissance and bombing records showed that between January and May 1944, approximately 30% of German bombing sorties in northern Norway targeted positions later confirmed as decoys. Those bombs represented resources diverted from actual military targets. The deception campaign didn't prevent all attacks on resistance positions, but it demonstrably reduced them by forcing German intelligence to distribute bombing resources across more targets than they could effectively strike. The strategy spread beyond Norway. British SOE documentation from 1944 shows that similar deception tactics using wooden vehicles, aircraft, and artillery were recommended to resistance groups across occupied Europe based on the Norwegian experience. SOE training materials from spring 1944 included detailed instructions for constructing convincing decoys using locally available materials. The instructions emphasized that perfect replication was unnecessary. The goal was creating plausible targets that forced enemy intelligence to expend reconnaissance and analysis resources. French resistance groups in the Vercors region adopted the technique in March 1944, building wooden artillery positions that drew German aerial reconnaissance attention away from actual defensive positions. Danish resistance used wooden structures to simulate military installations near Copenhagen, forcing German forces to maintain surveillance on empty positions. Yugoslav partisans constructed elaborate wooden vehicle parks that consumed German photographic reconnaissance resources throughout 1944. The technique's appeal was its accessibility. Sophisticated military deceptions typically required specialized equipment, technical expertise, and significant resources that resistance groups lacked. But wooden decoys required only basic carpentry skills, readily available materials, and understanding of how objects appeared from aerial observation altitudes. Any resistance group with access to lumber and simple tools could implement the strategy. This democratization of deception capability allowed the technique to spread rapidly across occupied territories. British intelligence analysis from late 1944 estimated that wooden decoys across occupied Europe had consumed approximately 15 to 20% of German aerial reconnaissance capacity during the critical period before D-Day. This represented hundreds of reconnaissance sorties, thousands of photographs, countless hours of intelligence analysis, all directed at targets with zero military value. The resource diversion wasn't decisive by itself, but it contributed to the broader intelligence picture that helped Allied forces achieve tactical surprise in several operations. The fundamental insight was simple. Aerial reconnaissance could be deceived if the cost of verification exceeded the benefit of certain identification. Creating uncertainty was more effective than attempting perfect concealment. Lars Sundsteby continued serving in Norwegian military after liberation, eventually reaching the rank of major in the Norwegian army. He wrote a memoir in 1978 describing his artillery battery's experience during occupation. In it, he dedicated a chapter to the wooden guns, emphasizing how knowledge that decoys existed elsewhere provided psychological reassurance to his crews. They understood they were not the only target, that German reconnaissance had multiple positions to track, that their survival was probabilistic rather than deterministic. That understanding made the fear manageable. The two brothers maintained close relationship after the war. Neither discussed what they had done during occupation in detail. There was an understanding between them that some things didn't require discussion. Gunnar had built wooden guns. Lars had operated real guns. The wooden guns had protected the real guns long enough for both brothers to survive. That was sufficient explanation. Norwegian Resistance Museum in Oslo holds one of the original wooden artillery pieces from the 1944 deception campaign. The gun sits in a climate-controlled display case, the pine wood preserved but showing obvious signs of age and weathering. Museum documentation notes that this particular piece was constructed in February 1944 by Milorg resistance fighters in Troms County and remained in position until German surrender in May 1945. German reconnaissance photographed it 17 times during that period. It was never bombed. Visitors can examine the wooden gun closely. The construction is crude. Chisel marks are visible. Proportions are approximate. The barrel is obviously wood grain rather than machined steel. Up close, the deception seems impossible to believe. How could anyone mistake this for real artillery? But the museum also displays photographs taken by German reconnaissance aircraft from 3,000 feet. In those photographs, the wooden gun looks plausible. The shadows are correct. The general shape matches actual artillery. The surrounding disturbance suggests military activity. From altitude, through a camera lens, in a moving aircraft taking hundreds of photographs during a single sortie, the wooden gun could easily be classified as probable artillery emplacement, requiring further investigation. That gap between close examination and distant observation was the entire strategy. The deception didn't need to fool someone standing next to the gun. It only needed to fool someone flying above it at 300 kilometers per hour, photographing everything in sight, trying to identify which of dozens of suspected positions warranted scarce bombing resources. The wooden artillery pieces were never meant to look perfect. They were meant to look plausible enough that German intelligence couldn't dismiss them immediately, forcing analysts to keep them in target databases, consuming reconnaissance time and analytical attention. Every hour German intelligence spent analyzing wooden guns was an hour not spent finding real guns. That principle, creating uncertainty rather than achieving perfect concealment, became core doctrine in military deception strategy. Modern military forces still use decoy equipment extensively, not because decoys fool close examination, but because they force adversaries to verify every contact, spreading reconnaissance and attack resources thin. The Norwegian wooden guns demonstrated this principle using pine logs and carpenter skills. Gunnar died in 1998 at age 85. His obituary in Tromsø newspaper mentioned his resistance work briefly, noting he had served with Milorg during occupation. It did not specify what he had done. Most people in Tromsø knew him as a carpenter who built well-constructed houses that lasted decades. The houses were his public legacy. But in Norwegian Resistance Museum archives, in the files documenting Milorg deception operations, his name appears repeatedly as the resistance member who pioneered techniques for constructing convincing wooden artillery using minimal resources. Other resistance groups copied his methods. The techniques spread because they worked and because they were accessible. Anyone with basic carpentry skills and wood could build a decoy that might save lives by drawing enemy attention elsewhere. That accessibility was crucial. Sophisticated deceptions required specialized skills and resources that resistance groups rarely possessed. But wooden guns required only wood, tools, and understanding of how artillery looked from above. The simplicity meant the strategy could scale across entire regions, creating dozens of decoy positions that collectively forced German intelligence to treat every suspected artillery position as potential threat requiring verification. The final accounting of the wooden artillery strategy appears in Norwegian military archives. Between January 1944 and May 1945, Milorg resistance groups constructed approximately 120 wooden artillery pieces across occupied Norway. German reconnaissance identified 93 of these positions through aerial photography. German intelligence classified 41 as probable decoys, 28 as probable real artillery, and 24 as uncertain. Bombing sorties destroyed 18 positions, of which 14 were decoys and 4 were real artillery batteries. The mathematics meant that wooden guns absorbed over 75% of German bombing attention, while representing 0% of actual military capability. Every bomb dropped on a wooden gun was a bomb that didn't destroy real artillery, didn't kill real resistance fighters, didn't disrupt actual military operations. The strategy didn't prevent all attacks, but it demonstrably reduced them by creating target uncertainty that German forces couldn't resolve without resources they didn't have. 47 men in Lars's artillery battery survived the war. Several died in post-liberation operations clearing German minefields. Most returned to civilian life. Few spoke publicly about their military service. Their survival was not guaranteed by wooden guns alone. Luck, German resource limitations, changing strategic priorities, and Allied advances all contributed. But the wooden guns were part of the system that created enough uncertainty to make their survival possible. That is what victory sometimes looks like in warfare. Not dramatic heroism, not perfect plans flawlessly executed, but simple deceptions that create sufficient uncertainty to make enemy decisions harder and survival more probable. A carpenter making wood look like steel from 3,000 feet. A brother protecting brother by creating doubt in enemy intelligence. Resistance fighters betting that observation from altitude could be deceived if the deception was plausible enough to force verification that wouldn't come. The wooden gun in Norwegian Resistance Museum still shows the chisel marks where Gunnar shaped the barrel in February 1944, working in -18-degree cold, hoping his brother would survive. The wood has aged gray. The barrel has split slightly from decades of temperature changes, but the shape remains recognizable. Pointed out to someone unfamiliar with the story, they might ask why a museum would display such a crude replica of artillery. Then show them the reconnaissance photographs. Show them how it looked from 3,000 feet. Show them the German intelligence reports that classified this wooden gun as probable artillery requiring continued observation. Show them the documentation proving this piece of pine wood occupied German reconnaissance attention for 15 months, consuming analytical time and photographic resources while real guns remained hidden and operational. The wood is still wood. But from 3,000 feet, through a camera lens, it was enough. That was all it needed to be. From 3,000 feet, through a camera lens, it was enough. That was all it needed to be.